And we get there early before the Johnny Cash show comes across. They come across separate. And we go in one night and we had these little 45 records.
Harold Reid spent 38 years standing in front of crowds of thousands, and he spent every single one of those years going home to the same small Virginia town where he was born. Most people who watched him on television, who bought his records, who sang along to his songs in their kitchens and their cars, never realized that the man making them laugh on stage was living almost an entirely separate existence just a few miles from the theater lights. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a secret marriage or a hidden family. It was something quieter and, in its own way, far more unusual. A famous man who simply refused to become famous in the way fame usually demands. Harold Reid was born in August of 1939 in Augusta County, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley, a region built on farmland, churches, and small manufacturing towns where everybody knew everybody else's business. His family wasn't wealthy, and they weren't connected to the music industry in any way. What they had was a church, and in that church, young Harold learned to sing. He gravitated toward the bass part almost immediately, the low, foundational voice that doesn't carry the melody and rarely gets the spotlight, but without which the entire harmony collapses. It's worth pausing on that choice, because it says something about who he was even as a teenager. He wasn't chasing the part that got noticed. He was drawn to the part that held everything else together. By his mid-teens, Harold was singing with a rotating group of local boys in gospel quartets around Staunton, Virginia, performing in churches for no pay and for audiences who had known them since they were children. In 1955, several of these young men formalized into a group, and 2 years later Harold's younger brother, Don, then only a young teenager himself, joined as the lead singer. Consider that decision for a moment. Harold, barely out of his teens, brought his kid brother into a singing group and then spent the next 4.5 decades performing next to him. Few professional partnerships anywhere last that long, and fewer still are built between siblings who started out shoulder to shoulder in a church pew. The group eventually became known as the Statler Brothers, a name that, despite what millions of fans assumed for decades, had nothing to do with an actual family. Only 2 of the 4 men in the group were related. The name itself came from a box of tissues sitting in a hotel room when the group needed something to call themselves in a hurry. It's a small, almost comic detail, but it reveals something important about the illusion that surrounded them for their entire career. Audiences wanted to believe in 4 brothers from a small town making music together, and in a strange way, they got exactly that, just not through blood. The other 2 members, men Harold had grown up singing with since adolescence, were as close to family as geography and shared history could make them. Their break came the old-fashioned way. Someone asked. Johnny Cash was scheduled to perform near Staunton, and the group, still an unknown local gospel act, managed to secure a meeting and ask if they could open the show. Cash liked what he heard enough to do something far more significant than let them open a single concert. He invited them onto his tour permanently. In 1964, the group turned fully professional, adopted the Statler Brothers name, and began an 8-year run as Cash's opening act and backing vocalists. This wasn't a minor gig. It placed 4 young men who had been singing in Virginia churches just months earlier onto the biggest stage in country music, standing beside the man who was, at that moment, becoming one of the most towering figures in American popular music. They appeared on Cash's legendary live album recorded at Folsom Prison, and when Cash was given his own network television program from 1969 to 1971, the Statler Brothers were fixtures on it, appearing weekly in front of a national audience at a time when television had only a handful of channels and no way to catch a misbroadcast. Harold was still in his 20s when that run began. By any reasonable measure, this was one of the great apprenticeships in the history of the genre, and it set the group up for a level of exposure that most acts spend a lifetime chasing and never reach. And yet, at the height of that opportunity, Harold Reid did something that ran completely against the grain of how the industry worked. He didn't move to Nashville. Neither did the rest of the group. The unwritten rule of the business was and remains simple. Proximity builds careers. You go where the labels are, where the session players are, where the deals get made in hallways and back rooms. Harold had a national platform, a famous mentor, and every professional incentive to relocate. He stayed in Staunton anyway, and he kept the group's home base there for the rest of its existence. When the Statler Brothers eventually retired in 2002, Harold was still living in the same town where he'd been born 63 years earlier. That wasn't sentimentality. It was a decision made deliberately over and over across nearly 4 decades, against the advice of an entire industry built on the opposite principle. The group's records started arriving almost immediately once they struck out on their own. Their first major hit, a somber, quietly aching song about a man insisting a little too forcefully that he was fine despite being completely alone, became a crossover success on both the country and pop charts and earned them a Grammy. It set a tone that would follow the group for years. Beneath the harmonies and the good humor, there was often a current of loneliness and reflection running through the material, something that felt older and more textured than a typical country group of the era. In 1972, they made the riskier move of leaving Cash Tour to headline under their own name, gambling that audiences had been coming to see them and not merely tolerating them as an opening act. The gamble paid off almost immediately. Within a couple of years, they were the most awarded vocal group in the history of country music, eventually earning 3 Grammy Awards and being named Vocal Group of the Year by the Country Music Association 9 separate times. Inside that machine, Harold carried 2 distinct responsibilities. Musically, he sang the bass line and, alongside his brother Don, wrote a significant portion of the group's original material, which was unusual for a harmony act of that era, since most vocal groups of the time relied heavily on outside songwriters. The second role was less tangible but arguably just as important to the group's identity. Harold became the voice between the songs, the one who talked to the crowd, told stories, and made people laugh. By the mid-1970s, that comic timing wasn't a minor addition to the show. For a great many fans, it was half the reason they bought a ticket. Perhaps the clearest evidence of how secure Harold was in his own identity came in 1974, at the peak of the group's success, when they released an entire album under a fabricated persona. Harold became a fictional, hapless bandleader fronting an imaginary, wildly untalented country act performing what was presented as a live recording at a high school gymnasium. It was a full album of intentionally bad music, released under a fake name, by a group that was, at that very moment, one of the most celebrated acts in the entire genre. Some listeners genuinely believed the fictional band was real. The material stayed in print for decades. It takes a particular kind of confidence to be at the absolute top of your profession and choose to spend studio time pretending, convincingly, to be terrible. Harold could do that because his sense of who he was had never depended on being told he was talented. That certainty had been built years earlier, singing bass in churches for no pay and no audience beyond his neighbors. The group weathered a significant lineup change in 1982 when one of the founding members left due to health issues, and a young singer named Jimmy Fortune stepped in. Rather than derailing the group, Fortune's arrival brought a new burst of creative success, including a #1 hit he wrote himself just 2 years later. Through the 1980s, Harold's stage presence only grew, and by the early 1990s the group launched a weekly variety program modeled on the kind of television they'd grown up watching as boys, complete with music, sketches, and guest performers. It became the highest-rated show on its network and introduced Harold to an entirely new generation of viewers who had no idea he'd already spent nearly 2 decades as one of the most decorated performers in country music. But the detail that reveals the most about who Harold Reid actually was has almost nothing to do with any stage, any award, or any broadcast. Starting in 1970, he co-founded and personally ran a free 4th of July celebration in Staunton called Happy Birthday, USA. It ran every single summer for the next 25 years, drawing tens of thousands of visitors to a town of roughly 25,000 residents, and it never cost a single attendee anything to walk through the gate. This wasn't a celebrity lending his name to a poster and showing up for a photograph. This was the largest event Harold organized in any given year of his life, built in the town where he lived, for the people he lived among, funded and staffed without a promoter or a record label behind it. For a quarter of a century, the shape of his year was consistent: travel the country being paid well to entertain strangers, then come home and stage the biggest event of the summer for his own neighbors, charging nothing. That contrast reached its strangest point in 1994, when a quiet country recording the group had made nearly 3 decades earlier suddenly appeared in a wildly popular film aimed at a completely different generation of moviegoers, introducing Harold's voice to millions of people who had never heard of the group and had no idea who was singing. That same summer, While a new and much younger audience was discovering that recording for the first time, Harold was at home doing exactly what he'd done every summer since 1970, organizing a free party for the people of Staunton. The public version of his life and the private one were running at full speed simultaneously, and only one of them was visible to most of the world. The group performed its final concert in October of 2002, choosing to end things on their own terms rather than let a long career fade slowly. There was no farewell tour, no extended victory lap. They played one last show in Virginia, not far from where the whole thing had begun in a church nearly 50 years earlier, and then they simply stopped. In the years that followed, Harold and his brother co-wrote a book together, and the group was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, one of the highest honors the genre can bestow. Harold quietly battled kidney failure for years afterward without turning it into a public story, and those close to him said he kept making people laugh through the illness the same way he always had, with no audience, no stage, and no reason to perform except that it was simply who he was. Harold Reid died at home in Staunton in April of 2020, at the age of 80, surrounded by his family. He had been married to the same woman for nearly 60 years. He had worked alongside his younger brother for over 4 decades without the partnership ever fracturing. He had lived in the same town from the day he was born until the day he died. There was no scandal buried in his history, no hidden vice waiting to be uncovered. The double life he led wasn't built on deception. It was built on a decision he made again and again, for nearly 50 years, to keep the largest part of himself rooted in a small Virginia town that never once made it onto an album cover. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.